welcome back to Noah's Window. And I've enjoyed this week talking about Elijah and all the things going on up in the Northern Kingdom, because I find so much common ground with what that must have been like in the world we're living in today. So today, we've been talking about what happened up on Mount Carmel, but we haven't got to the end of that story. Mark, can you tell a little bit about the end of that story?
Well, I think we kind of left it yesterday when the prophets of Baal were praying for their God to bring down fire from heaven and nothing happened. And then Elijah prayed. I remember, depending upon the English translation that you read, they prayed all day, nothing happened. Elijah prayed somewhere between 58 and 59 words in English. And he just said, God, I look to you. I'm your servant. Show these people that you're the true God. Bam, the fire fell from heaven.
And he had upped the challenge before that, because he had them just flood the altar with water.
I love Elijah's personality, because this is theatrical and dramatic, because nothing happened to their sacrifice. Elijah said, okay, let's build up the altar of the Lord. They did, put the bull on the altar, and then Elijah said, let's pour some water on this bull just so that there's no mistake. So they pour, I think, three buckets of water on the sacrifice, and Elijah said, do it again. I think there are 12 buckets.
It was really floating in the water.
Yeah, the water was flowing over to the side of the trench. So this is one very soggy sacrifice. And then Elijah prays that short prayer, fire falls from heaven, and the people cheer, and they said, he is God. And Elijah said, well, let's get rid of these false prophets while we're at it. So it was a big day and a big celebration. I'm sure Elijah went home that night and thought, we have won. There is revival in Israel. But then he got a text message the next day. Jezebel, the queen, wicked queen, so upset that Elijah had all of her prophets, her false prophets, whacked.
Because they were kind of hers.
They were hers, they were on her payroll. Mm-hmm. And so she sent off a message to Elijah that said, may the gods do to me what you did to these men if I don't kill you by this time tomorrow. So it's interesting. Elijah had just stood up on the top of the mountain. He was bold for God and had that great test and saw God answer by fire. But the next day when Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you, he runs from one person and he just wants to quit.
And the reason I really was hoping we could talk about this today is because I think he was in God's will, and yet right now he's overwhelmed.
Yeah.
He's overwhelmed by the situation, and partly he's overwhelmed because he's exhausted.
Yes.
So talk about that a little bit.
Well, there's so many things that come into play here, and I could get off in the weeds if I'm not careful, but I do think that some of this is really important for us, because the way I set the story up, I hope I got it across fully. Elijah's God's man. He's full of fire. He's got a dynamic personality. I love Elijah. He's the person I find most kinship with in the Bible. But there are several issues here, and I'm not really sure which one or maybe all of them came together to cause Elijah to become overwhelmed. One is his personality. His personality is, when it's high, it's very high. When he's low, he's very low. He's very mercurial, and that could have been part of it. The second thing is, when he left that day after the fire had fallen from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, Elijah thought, God has moved, God has worked, we've won.
And isn't that when Elijah runs so fast that he gets ahead of Ahab's chariot?
Yeah, I mean, he's
got to be physically exhausted.
He's just exuberant because he feels like we've won. And I think one of the toughest times in our lives, especially with personalities like mine and Elijah's, is when we think God has settled something, and then the next day it doesn't seem to be settled at all.
And I don't know about you on Noah's Window watching today, but I think we've all experienced that at some point when we see God do something really amazing, and it just feels like we're on this mountaintop, and yet Satan comes with an attack, and we just feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, I've had this happen in my life. You pray and you just feel like God has really moved. You know that God has done something, and then something happens right after that makes you feel like maybe it didn't solve anything. And really it's a second test of faith.
And what I loved here, when you read through the story, I hope you'll go get your Bible and read all of this, is how tenderly God takes care of Elijah when he's in this season.
Yeah, because Elijah, he runs for his life. Mm-hmm. And he's mad at God because he feels like God doesn't finish anything. And he's running from God, and he just, you and I have been to Israel, so we know he went down to Beersheba, which is in the southern part.
Desert.
In the desert, and then he runs down to Gaza, which is right there on the border down there in the desert. And then finally he winds up down at Sinai, which is
Way
down in
down in Arabia, isn't it?
Peninsula. So God comes to Elijah, and it's so interesting that God asks Elijah a question. He says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" You know, and I preached a sermon. Gosh, I was probably in my early 20s when I preached a sermon. I said, I don't know where the inflection was in that question that God asked, because I don't know if God was saying to Elijah, "What are you doing here?" That would have been a good question. Or he could have asked, "What are you doing here? And didn't I just bring down fire from heaven? So what are you doing running away? What are you doing here?" Or he could have been asking him, "What are you doing here? I mean, you're so far away from where you're supposed to be ministering." You know, I don't know where the inflection was, but God was asking Elijah, "What's going on with you? What are you doing here?" And clearly, as you point out, he was overwhelmed.
He was, but
So-
God took such good care of
Tender
him.
care.
Yeah, he encouraged him to rest.
Yeah, because
Made
when
provision for him.
it reminds me of the story, you know, when Jesus, after he rose from the grave, the disciples had been out fishing and didn't catch anything, and when they came, Jesus had fish and he had breakfast cooked for them.
Yeah.
Well, when Elijah would wake up, the angel of the Lord would have breakfast for him. He'd have, you know, bread and water for him, and God would say, "You need to eat and rest because
You
the
need to rest
journey's
and-
too hard for you."
Yeah. So he had him rest. He made provision for him, and he had him rest. And I just, you know, maybe the stage we're in our life and looking back over some of those more difficult days and looking at God's tender care.
Well, I know when we read this, you were really taken by the idea of being overwhelmed in the service of the Lord. You know, because
Right.
he's clearly in God's will. We see that on top of Mount Carmel. But somehow in that process of serving God, he got overwhelmed.
And I think sometimes we have the false impression that if we're serving God and we're doing God's will, that everything's going to be okay. And
Yeah.
that isn't how life works.
Well, when we look at the story, the way it was developing, and thankfully God arrested this, but it was Elijah is overwhelmed, and then the next thing was he wants to quit. Because you have this massive prophet, perhaps the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. He was saying to God, "I'm no better than my fathers. Just let me die. I'm the only one." And you know, whatever happened on Carmel back there, evidently it wasn't very much, because Jezebel sent me this text.
Well, yeah, but after he goes through this period of restoration, God does raise him up and continues to use him.
Yeah, and I know we could talk forever about this, and but again, if you read this, you'll see all these things. When Elijah finally gets down to Sinai, God kind of puts on a demonstration for him,
Oh, I love this.
and
Yes.
and so you know there's this massive earthquake, you know, and then there's this wind that's so powerful that it pulls the rocks out of the mountains. You know, there's several cataclysmic
There's
things
fire.
that happen. Fire. Yeah, but every time the Bible would say, but God was not in the fire, but God was not in the earthquake, God was not in the wind. And then it said there was a soft whisper.
Whisper.
And God was in that soft whisper. And I think, and this is just me kind of teaching Bible here. I don't know if this is really all that helpful for Noah's window. I think Elijah had come to believe that God only worked in those Mount Carmel fire from heaven experiences.
Big dramatic moments.
And because after that, God didn't keep bringing down fire from heaven and doing these extraordinary miracles, I think Elijah felt like God wasn't working. So God was saying, "Elijah, I want you to understand, I do work in the fire, but I also work in a soft whisper." And you know, so often we need to remember that, Mary Alice, that in these dark days where it seems like things are getting worse and worse, the soft whisper of God is still out there changing lives, answering prayers.
That's right.
You know, and meeting us in our moment of brokenness.
And even today, earlier today, we were hearing stories of the miraculous things God is doing around the world. So God is still at work. And when we're in those times of overwhelm, whether we're, even if we're doing God's work and we feel overwhelmed, you know, one of the things I think that had caused part of his overwhelm was he had gone through the drought with the people. It was God's judgment on the people, that drought was, but he had to live through the drought too. So there were a lot of reasons for him to be overwhelmed. And I guess I find common ground with that, because we can, you know, as judgment comes on our nation, and it surely will, we're living in it too.
Yeah.
But when we feel overwhelmed, I want to remember God's tender care in the midst of difficult times, and remember to listen to that still small voice. And remember, we just talked about yesterday, God does answer. He does hear, and he does answer. So we need to remember that sweet relationship we have with him and his tender care of us, even when we feel overwhelmed.
And just so that you know the rest of the story, when Jezebel fired off that text that she was going to kill Elijah, you know how they both left this world? Elijah went to heaven in a chariot of fire and didn't have to die, and Jezebel was eaten by dogs. So it's important to remember that God's got the final word on all of this.
That's right. That's right. He does. Well, I hope that was a blessing to you. We'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow here on Noah's Window.
And don't forget to check out some of these stories. I think you'll enjoy reading
Grab
them.
your Bible
They
and
read
read
real
through.
fast.
Yes.
We'll see you tomorrow.
God bless. See you soon.